I knelt in the middle of the stone basin, holding a weathered bear skull in both hands. Around me, hundreds of bones had been arranged with care. Leg bones laid parallel, ribs standing upright, deer antlers stacked from largest to smallest. Talk! I spun around. The deer bone I had accidentally kicked out of place was lying exactly where it had been before. Is somebody there? Only water answered, dripping onto stone. A fir trunk shook hard. A hand covered in dark brown-black hair tightened around the tree. I dropped the skull. A low growl rolled through the basin. Bigfoot's metallic gold eyes looked down at the skull, then moved straight to the backpack on my shoulders. That was when I remembered there was still another skull inside. A branch cracked. Bigfoot burst from the edge of the forest and came straight at where I stood. Hello, I'm Victor, and you're listening to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. Today's story is a work of fiction inspired by Sasquatch folklore and the remote forests of the Cascades. If you were Philip, would you return the skull or run? Comment, retain it or run. And now, everything begins with a discovery he should never have touched. Philip Warren reached the forest west of the Cascades on a late October morning under a low gray sky. The rain that had lasted through the night had stopped less than an hour earlier, leaving the ground covered in a soft, cold layer of black mud. Water still dripped from the tips of fir branches onto the shoulders of his jacket, so steadily that after a few minutes Philip stopped noticing it. According to what he wrote in his field notebook, the purpose of this trip was simple: to check whether the black bears in the area had changed their travel routes after fire season. 2 months earlier, a small wildfire had moved across the eastern slope, burning through the low brush and forcing many animals away from their usual feeding paths. After that, the first heavy rains of the season came too quickly, loosening soil, raising creeks, and breaking apart some of the natural corridors between valleys. To Philip, this was the kind of disruption large enough to change bear behavior, but not large enough to create an obvious migration. He wanted to know how they were adapting. Philip was 46 years old, lived in Bend, Oregon, and had spent almost 20 years tracking large mammals through the forests of the Pacific Northwest. He was not the kind of man who walked into the woods hoping to find the mysterious. He believed in tracks, scat, hair, claw marks, wind direction, and time. If an animal had passed through, it would leave something behind. If there was no evidence, Philip usually assumed people had seen wrong, heard wrong, or let fear fill in the empty space. That attitude made his colleagues trust him. It also made him trust himself more than he should have. For years, Philip had been used to being the calmest person in any survey group. When someone heard a strange sound, he identified the bird. When someone saw a black shape between trees, he pointed out a burned trunk. When a newcomer panicked over a large print, he measured depth, stride, and showed that it was only a bear track stretched long in the mud. The trip had originally been planned for 3 days. Philip carried a one-person tent, a cold-rated sleeping bag, a waterproof camera, a handheld navigation device, bear spray, a first aid kit, a satellite phone, and enough dry food for 4 days. He always packed one extra day beyond the plan, a habit formed after he had once been trapped by a flash flood in Idaho. Before leaving the vehicle, he sent one last message to his daughter, Mara, telling her he might be out of signal until the weekend. Mara answered with a thumbs-up symbol, then added one line: "Don't bring anything weird home again." She was studying archaeology and often teased her father about his habit of picking up small objects from the woods, even though Philip always insisted he only collected samples when necessary. He read the message, smiled, locked the vehicle, and began walking north along an old logging road that had almost been swallowed by young trees. For the first 2 hours, everything went exactly as he expected. Philip found black bear tracks near a dead berry patch, several claw marks on a cedar trunk, and a fresh pile of scat beside running water. He knelt, used a stick to check the texture, recorded the coordinates, and estimated that the bear had passed through within the last 12 hours. The direction of travel suggested that the bear was following the lower slope instead of crossing the valley, the way bears had done in previous years. That matched his original theory. Fire season had removed cover to the east, and heavy rain had pushed the main creek higher, so the bear had chosen a higher, drier route. Philip took photographs, marked the location on the map, and continued. Clear evidence like that made him feel the trip would be simple. There was a problem, there were traces, and there was an explanation. That was the familiar order he understood. The first sign that made him stop appeared near midday. At the edge of a small clearing, 3 saplings taller than a man had been twisted around one another. They were not merely bent by snow or wind. Their trunks were wrapped into a tight loop. The tops pointed in the same direction, and the bark had split into long strips. Philip stood several steps away and watched for nearly a minute before moving closer. He placed one hand on the lowest trunk. The break was fresh, with sap still seeping beneath the wet bark. The twist point sat close to 7 feet above the ground. A large black bear might reach that height if standing on its hind legs. But the way the trunks had been turned into one another did not resemble clawing or feeding behavior. Philip looked around for caught hair, claw marks, or deep prints. There was nothing. About half a mile later, Philip found the first cluster of stones. 3 gray rocks, each almost the size of a fist, had been stacked on top of one another in the middle of a stretch covered with rotting leaves. The bottom stone was flat, the second leaned slightly, and the top one was round, with a white line running across its surface. The stack stood too well balanced for the uneven ground around it. Philip crouched, checked the soil beneath it, and saw that the leaves had been brushed aside. Someone had placed the rocks there. The most obvious answer was a hunter or hiker marking a route. Although this area saw very little traffic, it was not completely isolated. Philip had seen deer hunters use rocks, cloth tape, or branches to point toward camp. This time, Philip stopped longer. He opened the navigation device and checked the distance between the 2 locations. They were nearly 1,000 feet apart. He tried drawing an imaginary line between the twisted saplings and the stone stack, and realized both pointed toward the same area to the northwest. He noted that, but still assumed it was a hunter's marking system. If a group of people entered deep woods often, they might use similar stone stacks to identify a route. The only unusual part was that Philip saw no boot prints, shell casings, tied cord, knife marks on trees, or anything else that usually came with human activity. The previous night's rain could have erased footprints, but it could not erase every trace. He thought about that, then pushed it aside. A good field surveyor was not allowed to turn the absence of evidence into evidence for something he wanted to believe. By afternoon, the forest grew thicker. Old Douglas firs stood close together, their trunks so wide that 2 grown adults could not wrap their arms around them. The gray light remained trapped in the canopy, making the ground look blue-black, even though it was not yet evening. Philip slowed down to avoid slick roots. Here he began seeing more broken branches. What caught his attention was that they had all been bent in the same direction, toward the northwest, the same direction the stone stacks had indicated. Some branches were at chest height. Others stood above his head. The breaks were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and not yet brown. Philip checked each one, looking for elk bite marks or bear claw marks, but found none. Close to 3 in the afternoon, Philip noticed something else. Animal sign disappeared. Not just bear sign. There were no deer tracks, squirrel marks, rabbit trails, or birds searching for food beneath the leaves. Across a stretch of soft ground more than 100 yards long, the surface remained almost untouched after the rain. That was rare in this forest. Even when larger animals avoided an area, smaller species usually left marks behind. Philip stood still and listened. He heard water running somewhere below the slope, raindrops falling from leaves, and high wind moving through the treetops. No birds calling to one another. No squirrels racing over bark. No small branches snapping back under the feet of animals. Around 4 o'clock, Philip found the first large track beside a muddy pool. It was not complete. There was only a long, broad depression at the front that narrowed toward the rear, as if something heavy had stepped down and slid slightly. Philip knelt beside it and took out a measuring tape. The mark was nearly 16 inches long, but there was no clear outline of toes. He looked around and found 2 more depressions set far apart. To an inexperienced person, they might look like the tracks of a being walking on 2 legs. To Philip, they were distorted bear prints. When a bear places a hind foot close to where the front foot landed, the 2 prints can overlap and create one long mark that resembles a human foot. Soft mud and rainwater stretch the shape even more. What Philip did not realize then was that all the signs lay along one line: the twisted trees, the 3 stone stacks, the broken branches, the empty stretch of forest with no animal tracks, and the large depressions in the mud. They were not appearing randomly around his survey route. They formed a chain leading northwest. Only when the rescue team copied the coordinates from his device, days later, would that pattern become clear. On a map, the points formed what looked almost like a curved corridor, avoiding the main trail and angling toward a narrow, unnamed ravine. Philip had recorded every part of the system, but he had never placed the pieces beside one another. His knowledge helped him identify each sign separately. That same knowledge kept him from asking whether they belonged to one intention. As the light began to fade, Philip found a raised patch of ground near the creek and made camp. The area was flat, had 3 large trees blocking the wind, and sat far enough from the water to avoid the risk of a nighttime rise. He removed his backpack, set up the tent, hung the food bag from a branch, and checked his equipment again. The satellite phone still had more than half its battery. The camera worked normally. The temperature was dropping fast, but not dangerously. Philip boiled water, ate a portion of dried soup, and opened his notebook to organize the day's notes. He wrote about the bear tracks, the new travel route, the twisted trees, the 2 stone stacks, and the silent area. At the bottom of the page, he added one sentence: possible hunters in the area, but no recent sign. He stopped writing and looked into the forest. From where he sat, he could see a broken branch more than 60 feet off the ground, the tip still pointing northwest. A feeling he could not quite name appeared in his chest. Not exactly fear, only the awareness that the forest around his camp seemed to have been arranged before he arrived. Philip closed the notebook. He laughed quietly at himself for thinking that. Forests do not arrange messages for people. Trees break because of wind. Stones are placed by hunters. Tracks belong to bears. Silence is only weather. Everything had an explanation, and Philip had spent nearly 20 years learning how to find those explanations. He did not know that while he sat under the tarp and turned every sign into a separate event, someone was standing at the edge of the light, watching the way he wrote things down. The watcher did not come closer. The watcher made no sound. And to the northwest, where all the broken branches pointed, a basin full of bones was waiting behind the wet forest. Philip left camp when light pushed through the low clouds, though the forest still felt cold and gray. He placed a battery in his pocket, wiped the lens, and added a few lines about the ring of bird bones outside the tent. In his notebook, he wrote carefully, possibly carried there by animals. But as he walked northwest, Philip noticed he was moving in the exact direction the camera had been turned toward during the night. The broken branches, the 3 stone stacks, and the stretch of forest without animal tracks all sat along the same route. He did not call it a trail. He only told himself he was following a natural corridor between slopes. Even so, Philip still did not understand that those scattered signs were leading him toward a place kept under guard. The ground grew steeper. Old fir trunks stood close together, their roots rising from the black soil like large veins. Philip had to use one hand for balance as he stepped over moss-covered stone. About 100 yards later, he found 2 branches broken at shoulder height. Both pointed forward. The breaks were fresh, the wood inside pale and wet. He photographed them, then measured the height. A bear standing on its hind legs could have reached that point, but bears did not usually break several branches in the same direction. Philip noted the irregularity and continued because he still saw no direct danger. Near noon, he saw the deer antler. It was caught sideways between 2 branches, almost 7 feet above the ground. One end pointed down, while the other aimed toward a narrow rock passage ahead. No skin, hair, or tissue remained on the surface. The antler was old, gray-brown, but the base where it touched the branch was free of moss, which showed it had been placed there fairly recently. Philip stood underneath it and studied it for almost a minute. Wind could not lift something that heavy to that height. A deer also could not shed an antler into that exact position between 2 branches. He took photographs from 3 angles and searched for boot prints. There was nothing except wet leaves and a few faint depressions. He wanted to return to camp, but professional curiosity was stronger. If hunters had placed the antler as a trail marker, there could be a temporary camp, a bait site, or an illegal kill site ahead. Philip had helped investigate poaching before, and he knew illegal hunting groups often chose hidden areas close to water and far from logging roads. That possibility made more sense, so he kept going. 2 fallen trees blocked the entrance to the rock passage. They crossed each other in the shape of an X, with roots pulled from the ground but no fresh drag marks. Between the 2 trunks was a low opening, just wide enough for someone to crouch and crawl through. Philip removed his backpack, pushed it ahead of him, then dropped to his knees and crawled after it. When his shoulders cleared the other side, the sound of the creek behind him suddenly became smaller. The basalt walls on both sides held the sound back, creating the feeling that he had just entered a closed room. Ahead of him was not the narrow ravine he had expected. The terrain opened into an oval basin, almost 100 feet long, surrounded by low rock walls and old trees. Water ran down from a small crack along the northern edge, forming a shallow pool before disappearing under the stones. Gray light fell into the open space, bright enough for Philip to see everything on the ground. He stood motionless. Bones were everywhere, not just a few scattered pieces around a feeding spot. Hundreds of bones had been divided into clear sections. Near the eastern wall were bundles of deer leg bones, placed parallel from longest to shortest. The large joints faced one end, and the smaller ends pointed toward the center. Nearby, ribs stood upright, leaning against a rotten trunk like books on a shelf. Some were bleached white, others were still yellow-brown, but none of them lay in disorder. On the southern side, deer antlers had been stacked in several layers. The largest pairs lay on the bottom, with smaller pairs placed above them, all the tines turned outward. Elk antlers, heavier and wider, sat in a separate group. Near the water's edge were skulls from black bears, wild pigs, and several smaller predators. They did not all face the same direction, but they had been divided by size. The largest skulls lay closest to the water, while the smaller ones were arranged farther back. Philip stepped forward, trying not to disturb anything. Professional instinct made him observe before touching. He studied the ground around the bone clusters, searching for drag marks, claw marks, or scat from scavengers. There was none. The bones were unusually clean. Some showed weathering and cracks from age, but very few had tooth marks. There was none of the chaotic gnawing left by wolves, coyotes, or bears. There were no small fragments crushed open for marrow. No hair, dried hide, or smell of decomposition. He walked through the basin and counted more than 20 skulls and hundreds of long bones. There were bones from black-tailed deer, wild pigs, black bears, bobcats, and at least 2 species he could not identify immediately. The bones of herbivores were not mixed with those of predators. Antlers were not placed beside jaws. Leg bones were not mixed with vertebrae. The separation was too clear to be accidental, but it also did not resemble any legal human collection. Philip took out the camera, photographed the whole area, then moved closer to each group. Every photograph included a measuring tape or an object for scale. He recorded north orientation, the slope of the ground, the location of the water source, and the distance between the clusters. After 10 minutes, caution gave way to focus. He no longer felt as if he were standing in a frightening place. He felt as if he had found something never documented before. He wondered whether hunters could have created the place over many years. But there were no saw marks, knife marks, or axe marks on most of the bones. There was no cord, no hook, no trap, no shell casing. If this were a kill site, the bones should have been mixed with trash. If this were a display, why hide it deep inside a ravine with no easy access? Philip wrote, "Intentional structure. Human or animal origin unknown." The final sentence made him stop writing. Animals did not arrange hundreds of bones by size. That was what he believed. Some birds collected shiny objects. Beavers organized branches. Elephants could return to places where the bones of their own kind lay. But this place went beyond any behavior he had ever observed. Philip looked around, aware for the first time that he might be standing inside the territory of an unknown being. Just then, the sound of water dripping from the rock wall became clearer. Tap, tap, tap. Philip turned his head but saw nothing. No movement, no footsteps. He reminded himself that the basin made sound echo in unusual ways. After several seconds, he continued measuring. To see the ground beneath the row of ribs, Philip used the tip of his boot to push 2 pieces aside. They struck each other with a dry, small sound. He bent down and saw no ash, charcoal, or sign of burning underneath. That ruled out the possibility that this was a disposal pit used by hunters. He moved to a cluster of leg bones, lifted one, checked the surface, and set it down close to its original position. Each action made him feel that he was following proper procedure. Near the water's edge, Philip noticed a small bare skull lying on top of a stack of bones. It was almost intact, missing only 1 molar, with a round depression at the back. He put on gloves, lifted it, and turned it under the gray light. The depression did not resemble a bullet mark. The edge of the bone had been pressed inward, as if a powerful, blunt force had struck it. Philip wanted to examine it in a lab and compare it with injuries caused by falling rocks or impact trauma. He knew he should not collect a sample before determining who managed the area. He also knew a physical specimen might help explain the place. Philip stood still for several seconds, weighing the choice, then opened a sample bag inside his backpack. He wrapped the skull in cloth, placed it inside, and pulled the zipper shut. The moment the zipper closed, a bird on the rock wall shot into the air. After that, the basin went completely still. Philip did not know yet that from that moment on, he was no longer an observer. He had become an intruder, and the one who had arranged every bone in that place had seen exactly what he had taken. Philip stood still beside the water, his hand still resting on the zipper of the backpack. The silence came down so quickly that he noticed it at once. Before that, even though the forest had been quiet, there had still been a few short bird calls from the rock wall and the beat of wings in the fir canopy. Now, all of it was gone. Only water kept falling drop by drop onto stone, along with the sound of his own breathing, echoing inside the closed basin. He lifted his head and looked around. The rows of bones remained motionless under the gray light. There was no wind strong enough to move the branches. No animal shadow crossed the ground. Philip reminded himself that one bird leaving the rock wall could have startled the others into leaving too. So the silence did not prove anything. Still, the feeling of being watched had returned. clearer this time than it had been the night before. Philip closed his notebook and meant to leave the basin. As he stepped back, the heel of his boot struck a deer leg bone lying near the eastern row. The bone rolled out of place, hit two other pieces, and stopped on the wet ground. Tock, tock. He bent down, but, before he could pick it up, a sound came from behind him. Whoosh! Something white dropped beside his foot and buried one end halfway into the soft mud. It was the same bone he had just kicked out of place. Philip jerked backward, his hand grabbing for the bear spray. He looked toward the row of bones. The empty spot where the bone had been was still there. There was no way it had sprung up by itself and flown around behind him. A person, or an animal, had picked it up and thrown it back. Is somebody there? Philip's voice struck the rock walls and came back weak. There was no answer. He turned slowly, studying every dark opening between the trees. Everything stayed still. He pulled the camera from its strap. While checking the screen, Philip remembered he had taken dozens of photographs since entering the basin. If someone had been watching him, the camera might have captured it. The first image showed the full bone area from near the entrance. Philip zoomed in on the western edge of the trees. There was nothing except stone, moss, and black fir trunks. The second image showed the row of deer antlers. In the left corner, a tall, dark strip rose higher than the brush, but it could have been a burned trunk. He moved to the next image. The dark strip was still there, but the position had changed. It stood between two trees almost 20 feet from the previous place. Philip stopped breathing for several seconds. He moved backward through the images in order. In the first photograph, the shape was near the edge of the rock wall, about 100 feet from him. 12 minutes later, it appeared behind a cedar. 7 minutes after that, a dark shoulder showed from behind a closer fir. In the photograph where Philip was measuring the row of leg bones, the shape was only about 60 feet away. None of the photographs showed the whole body. Each time, only a different part was visible: a shoulder, the edge of a head, the curve of an arm, or a patch of dark hair tucked between wet leaves. The position changed deliberately, as though the being knew how to stay out of the center of the frame. Philip checked the timestamp on the first photo and compared it with the picture of the skull. The gap between them was 40 minutes. Through all that time, whatever stood at the edge of the forest had moved closer bit by bit, without making a sound loud enough for him to notice. What unsettled Philip was not just the distance. It was the timing of the response. The being had watched him measure, take photographs, and move between the rows of bones. It had done nothing. Only after he put the skull into his backpack did the birds fall silent, the bone get thrown back, and the invisible circle close around him. A branch scraped against bark to the west. Philip turned the camera in that direction. At first, he saw only a large fir trunk. Then the darkness beside it shifted. A massive hand was gripping the bark. The fingers were long and thick, covered in hair across most of the back of the hand. They did not have curved claws like a bear. The hand tightened, making the wet bark creak. The being leaned out far enough for Philip to see the left shoulder. He was more than 8 feet tall, even with the knees slightly bent. Thick charcoal brown hair, mixed with gray, covered the shoulders and arms, darker across the chest. His shoulders were so wide, the tree trunk could not hide his whole body. His arms hung low, almost to the knees, longer than the proportions of any man Philip had ever met. The face appeared last. A low forehead, heavy brow ridge, and broad lower jaw gave him the look of something more ancient than a man, but not like an ape. The nose was wide, though not completely flat. The eyes were deep-set, amber brown, and did not blink. A white scar ran from the left temple, down near the cheekbone, cutting across the shorter hair on the face. Philip did not raise the camera to take a picture. He did not dare make another sound. The most frightening part was that the Bigfoot did not look straight into his eyes. His gaze lowered and stopped on the backpack behind Philip's shoulders. When Philip shifted his body, those eyes followed the bag. The Bigfoot knew exactly where the stolen object had gone. Philip slowly slipped one backpack strap off his shoulder. The Bigfoot tightened his grip on the tree. Crack! A large patch of bark peeled away beneath his hand. Philip stopped. He understood. The movement was not an invitation to come closer. It was a warning. The Bigfoot did not need to roar or charge to say what he wanted. Every photograph, the bone thrown back, and the gaze fixed on the backpack, all pointed toward the same demand. Return what was taken. But Philip still did not do it. Part of him was afraid. Another part was still thinking about the lab, the scientific report, and the evidence that could change his career. He told himself that if he could just get out of the basin, he would call for support and return later with safer procedures. Philip backed toward the entrance. The Bigfoot stayed behind the tree, motionless. Philip took one more step back. The amber eyes did not leave the backpack. When Philip turned, a single wood knock sounded from deep in the forest ahead. Tock! Another answered from behind him. Tock! Philip stood between the two sounds, and for the first time he understood that he was no longer choosing his own way out. The section below contains exactly 1,100 words, not counting the chapter title. Chapter 5. The Siege. With rules, Philip turned toward the basin entrance, trying to walk slowly, so the Bigfoot behind him would not react. The two fallen trees that had once left enough space for him to crawl through were still there, but their position had changed. One trunk had been dragged sideways, closing the gap. The other lay across it with wet roots driven deep into the mud like a lock pin. Philip looked at the ground torn into long grooves. There were no tire tracks, no rope marks, and no tools. Someone had moved both trees while he was inside. He tried to push the lower trunk. It did not move. Waterlogged wood was heavier than it looked, and the trunk was almost as wide as his chest. Philip looked up at the two rock walls around the basin. The left side rose steep and slick with moss. The right side had a narrow crack leading upward, but sharp stones sat stacked in. Unstable layers. The old route was still the safest way out if it had remained open. 3 knocks came from the east. Tock! 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 2 more answered from the west. Tock! Tock! Philip turned slowly, but he could not see the Bigfoot. The sound bounced off the stone, making distance hard to judge. It could have come from 2 different places. It also could have been one individual moving very quickly around the rim of the basin. The second thought tightened the skin along his neck, because only a few seconds separated the 2 sets of knocks. Philip tried the rock crack on the right. He slipped one backpack strap off to climb more easily, set his boot on the lowest stone, and grabbed a root. Just as his hand touched the remaining strap, a single knock sounded behind him. Tock! He stopped. When he took his hand off the backpack, the forest went still. Philip tried again, slower this time. His finger had barely hooked the strap when the knock came again, closer. Tock! The connection was too clear. The Bigfoot was watching every movement, and the object that mattered was still inside the sample bag. He could see every small motion Philip made. Philip looked toward the place where he had seen the amber eyes. Only dark fir trunks remained, along with a pale patch of stripped bark. "You want this, don't you?" Philip called, his voice rough. No answer came. He stepped away from the rock crack, removed the backpack, and set it on the ground. At once, the knocking stopped completely. The air around the basin stayed tense, but this silence felt like waiting. Philip opened the main compartment. Inside, the sample bag wrapped around the skull lay between his rain jacket and first aid kit. He placed one hand on it, but did not take it out. He thought about the photographs, the depression in the skull, and the chance to prove this place had not been created by hunters. If he returned it, he still had pictures, but blurry pictures could be dismissed. The skull with the unusual trauma was real evidence, something that could be measured, scanned, and analyzed. Philip pulled the sample bag out. A large stone dropped in front of him. Thud. Mud splashed onto his pant leg. The stone landed less than 3 feet from the toe of his boot. If the Bigfoot had wanted to hit him, the stone would not have missed by much. This was not an attack. It was a line placed on the ground. Philip backed up, holding the sample bag against his chest. From the left, a thick branch snapped downward. Crack. That was the direction he had just considered running. He turned right. A smaller rock rolled down from the wall and stopped in the climbing crack. Every path he looked toward, the Bigfoot reacted before he could take a step. Philip understood he was being herded, but not the way a predator drives prey into a dead corner. Bigfoot did not rush him when his back was turned. He did not throw the stone at his body. He simply closed each exit until the only remaining choice was to return the skull to its proper place. He opened the cloth. The bare skull appeared, the frontal bone pale under the gray light. The moment it was exposed, a deep breath sounded from the tree line. Philip could not see the Bigfoot's face, but he knew he was close. "All right," he said. "I'll put it back." Philip bent as if preparing to return to the row of bones. But curiosity and ambition still pulled him in another direction. If he could make the Bigfoot believe the object had been returned, he could hide the skull outside the basin, mark the spot, and come back with colleagues. That way he could escape and still keep the evidence. He walked slowly toward the southern edge, where a rotten trunk lay beneath a patch of ferns. Every step was followed by the sound of leaves compressing at the edge of his vision. Philip knelt, lifted a slab of rotten bark, and pushed the skull into the hollow underneath. He covered it with leaves, set the bark back in place, and stood with the empty sample bag. No knock sounded. Philip thought the plan had worked. He put the backpack on, backed away from the trunk, and headed for the rock crack on the right. This time, when he touched the strap, the forest stayed quiet. He climbed 2 steps, his pulse racing because he believed the Bigfoot had been fooled. Behind him, the rotten trunk tore up from the ground. Thud. Philip turned. A hair-covered arm lifted the log aside as if it were a dry branch. The Bigfoot bent down, took the skull from the hiding place, and stood straight. In the gray light, the white scar on his left cheek was clear. The Bigfoot looked at the skull, then at Philip. A thin crack now ran along the temple, likely formed when Philip dropped it earlier. The Bigfoot touched one finger to the crack. His shoulders slowly rose. A low growl rolled through the basin, not loud, but strong enough to make the water near the rock tremble in small rings. Philip understood his deception had changed the warning into something else. The Bigfoot placed the skull down with great care. Then he stepped out and blocked the only remaining way. The Bigfoot stood between the rock crack and the basin, his massive body filling almost the entire way out. The bare skull lay at his feet, a thin crack running from the temple down near the eye socket. The Bigfoot lowered his head, looked at the fracture, touched one fingertip lightly to the broken bone, then raised his eyes. The amber eyes were no longer only watching the backpack. This time, they looked straight at Philip. Philip stood on the rocky slope with 1 foot higher than the other, his back pressed against the wall. The distance between them was less than 30 feet. He could hear water dripping from the rock, the Bigfoot's heavy breathing, and the rush of his own heartbeat in his ears. The Bigfoot did not charge right away. He lifted the skull in both hands, walked toward the open ground in the center of the basin, and set it down very slowly, as if afraid the crack might spread. Then the Bigfoot extended one long arm and pointed at the skull. He turned his hand toward the rows of bones behind Philip, then pointed down at the ground in front of him. The message needed no words. Bring it back. Philip looked over his shoulder. From where he stood, he was only about 40 yards from the row of bare skulls. If he obeyed, maybe the Bigfoot would let him leave. But whatever remained of his reason still could not tell whether this was a demand or the first step of an attack. He had seen black bears bluff a retreat to draw people closer. He had read reports of large animals keeping distance before suddenly charging. His field instincts told him not to turn his back on a being stronger than he was. The Bigfoot pointed again. Philip slowly moved his right hand toward the bear spray clipped to his side. The Bigfoot saw the movement. His shoulders dropped lower, and his head tilted slightly to one side. But he stayed where he was. "Don't come closer," Philip said. "I'm leaving. Just stay where you are." His voice was dry and weaker than he wanted. He pulled out the spray and removed the safety with his thumb. The small snap of plastic sounded too clear inside the closed basin. The Bigfoot backed up half a step, not from fear, but as if judging the strange object in Philip's hand. Philip raised the canister to chest height. The nozzle aimed straight at the Bigfoot's face. "Back up." The Bigfoot released a low rumble. Philip pressed the trigger. An orange cloud blasted from the canister, but the ravine created a sudden backdraft. Most of the chemical mist pushed left, swept across the Bigfoot's shoulder, then blew back toward Philip. His eyes burned at once. His throat closed. He coughed hard, turned his face away, and squeezed his eyes shut by reflex. The Bigfoot roared. This time the sound was powerful enough that Philip felt the vibration move through the rock wall behind his back. When he opened his eyes through tears, he saw the Bigfoot crouched low, both arms spread, feet planted deep in the mud. 30 feet vanished in a few steps. Philip barely managed to lift the spray again. A huge hand swept sideways across his wrist. The metal canister flew from his grip, struck the rock wall, and rolled down toward the water. The blow did not hit his face or chest, but the force ran up his arm and left his fingers numb. The Bigfoot turned the upper half of his body and drove his shoulder into Philip. Philip lost balance, slid off the rock step, and dropped onto the wet ground. The backpack slammed against his back. Air burst from his lungs and he could not cry out. For several seconds he lay curled on his side, trying to pull breath back in. A great shadow covered the light above him. Philip rolled sideways, one hand searching for the multi-tool knife in his pocket. Just as his fingers touched the handle, the Bigfoot's broad foot came down on the ground beside his wrist. Mud splashed across Philip's face. The Bigfoot did not step on his hand, but the distance was no more than the width of 2 fingers. Philip let go of the knife. The Bigfoot bent down, grabbed the backpack strap, and lifted Philip off the ground in one motion. The strap cut painfully into his shoulder. The Bigfoot did not drag him far. He only jerked once, hard enough to pop the chest buckle open and pull the backpack off Philip's body. Philip dropped to his knees. The Bigfoot opened the main compartment by pulling the 2 sides of the zipper in opposite directions. The zipper teeth burst apart, but the fabric did not tear to pieces. He took out the empty sample bag, smelled it, and turned it over in his hand. When he did not find the skull inside, the Bigfoot looked toward where the skull lay, then back at Philip. That look made Philip understand. He was not only looking for the missing object. He was checking whether Philip had hidden anything else. Philip raised both hands. "There's nothing else." The Bigfoot threw the sample bag down beside Philip's feet. He searched the backpack once more, ignoring the food, camera, notebook, and first aid kit. Only when he was certain there were no other bones inside did he set the backpack down. Not the habit of a hungry animal. Not blind rage. Every movement served the same purpose. The Bigfoot turned back and picked up the bear skull. He held it in one hand, while the other grabbed the back of Philip's jacket near the shoulder. Philip was pulled upright as easily as a child. When he tried to step back, the Bigfoot tightened slightly around the fabric and pulled him forward. No claws tore through skin, no teeth came down. He used only enough force for Philip to understand that resistance was useless. Philip stumbled toward the rows of bones. Each time he slowed, the hand behind his shoulder increased pressure by only a little. When he moved in the right direction, the grip eased. The Bigfoot was adjusting Philip's behavior in a way so clear it made him feel cold inside. When they reached the middle of the basin, Philip tried to lean left, hoping to break away from the path. The Bigfoot immediately moved the grip from his shoulder to his arm and turned him back without throwing him down. Pain flashed through the shoulder joint, but it did not break. Philip realized that if the Bigfoot wanted to snap the arm, he could do it right there. He was trying not to cause more injury than necessary. A thick branch lay across the path. Philip tripped over it and went down on one knee. The Bigfoot stopped and waited for him to stand instead of dragging him. That moment changed the shape of Philip's fear. He still believed he might die, but he no longer thought he was being hunted. He was being escorted. The Bigfoot led him to the row of skulls near the water's edge. He placed the cracked skull in the empty spot, then used one finger to point at the bones. Philip had shifted while measuring. One rib leaned out of place. 2 leg bones had been pushed out of line. A small pair of antlers had slipped from the upper layer. The Bigfoot stepped back 3 paces. Philip knelt down, still coughing from the chemical spray. He reached toward the nearest bone and stopped. The Bigfoot gave a short rumble, not violent, but enough to make him continue. That was when Philip fully understood what was happening. The Bigfoot had not attacked because he saw a human. He had not reacted when Philip took pictures or walked through the basin. He had acted only after Philip removed the skull, damaged it, and tried to hide it. The attack was not a loss of control. It was a limited punishment, carried out to force him to repair what he had disturbed. For the first time in his career, all the knowledge Philip carried did not help him control the situation. It only helped him understand. Philip picked up the first bone. Behind him, the Bigfoot stood still and watched. Philip knelt before the row of bones near the water, his right hand still shaking from pain, his eyes still burning. The Bigfoot stood about 10 feet away, his enormous body motionless in the gray light. He was not growling anymore. Only the amber eyes followed each movement Philip made, enough to make him understand that one more wrong choice would no longer count as a mistake. He started with the rib leaning near his foot. Philip lifted it, studied the row of ribs standing beside the rotten trunk, and set it in the nearest gap. As soon as his hand left the bone, the Bigfoot turned to the fur beside him and knocked once. "Talk." Philip looked again. The distance between the rib he had placed and the 2 beside it was wider than the other spacing in the row. He moved it about 2 inches to the left. No knock came. He understood that was the answer. Philip continued with the 2 leg bones that had been pushed out of line. He arranged them by length, placing the larger one outside and the smaller one inside. The Bigfoot knocked once again. Philip switched the 2 bones. This time the Bigfoot stood still. There was no sign of pleasure or approval, only silence showing that the order had been restored as it had been before. That chilled Philip more than the attack itself. The Bigfoot had not only recognized which bones had been moved, he remembered the spacing, direction, and exact order of each one. In a place containing hundreds of bone fragments, the Bigfoot still knew precisely what belonged where. Philip crawled to the deer antler cluster. A small pair had shifted when he stepped over it while measuring. He placed them on the top layer, with the tines facing outward. The Bigfoot did not react. Philip moved to the second antler, but the moment he turned the base toward the east, the knock came again. "Talk." He turned it toward the west. Silence. Philip looked at the antlers, stacked from largest to smallest, and realized for the first time that they were not sorted by size alone. All the bases pointed toward the center, while the tines opened outward like a defensive ring. He did not know whether that was beauty, a marker, or some other system. He only knew the Bigfoot remembered the structure better than a museum curator. When Philip set the last bone back near the rib row, the Bigfoot walked to the stack of bare skulls. He bent down, touched the cracked skull, and pointed at the empty space near the water. Philip understood that he had to place it himself. He accepted the skull with both hands. The Bigfoot released it slowly, as if making sure Philip would not drop it again. The weight was not great, but in Philip's hands it felt heavier than any specimen he had ever carried. Philip knelt and placed the skull on top of two smaller ones. The Bigfoot knocked on the tree. Talk. Philip looked closely. Mud on the bottom showed that the skull had once sat lower. He lifted the whole stack piece by piece, trying to remember the order he had seen at the start. When he moved the largest skull aside, an empty hollow appeared beneath the rotting leaves. There were no bones inside. There was an old compass with cracked glass, the needle frozen in place. Beside it lay a green-stained brass belt buckle, a piece of red wool cloth almost rotted away, and a man's wedding ring covered in dirt. The objects sat close together, hidden beneath the skull stack as their own separate group. Philip reached toward the compass. The Bigfoot gave a low rumble. He pulled his hand back. There was no human skull, no arm bone, no leg bone. Philip looked around the other sections, but he saw no remains that could belong to the owner of the ring. That made the discovery harder to understand. The man may have died in the forest, or the Bigfoot may have picked the objects up from an abandoned camp, or someone may have been brought here like Philip and released, but left belongings behind. None of those answers had evidence. Philip replaced the skulls, covering the hollow again. The Bigfoot watched until the last one rested in its proper place. This time, no knock came. He stepped back once. Philip sat back on his heels, breathing with difficulty. The camera still hung at his chest, holding photographs of the basin and several blurred frames of the Bigfoot. He understood that he still carried something that could lead people back to this place. If the Bigfoot knew what a camera did, he might see that as another kind of theft. Philip removed the camera and opened the memory card slot. His fingers shook as he pressed the small card loose. He placed it in his palm, then set it on the ground between them. "This is everything," he said. "I won't take anything." The Bigfoot looked at the memory card. He stepped closer, bent low, and smelled the small object. One thick finger touched the edge lightly. Philip waited for him to crush it or pick it up and carry it away. But the Bigfoot only pushed the memory card back toward him. Philip did not understand right away. He picked it up and set it farther away, near the row of bones. The Bigfoot used a fingertip to slide it back toward Philip's knee. The gesture could not be mistaken. He did not want the memory card. He did not care about the photographs. Philip picked the card up and looked toward the restored rows of bones. The Bigfoot had never tried to break the camera, take the notebook, or stop him from observing. He had reacted only when objects inside the basin were moved, taken, and damaged. The Bigfoot was not protecting the secret of his existence. He was protecting the order of this place. Philip returned the memory card to the camera. He slowly stood, both hands open in front of his body. The Bigfoot looked around the basin once, from the antler rows to the leg bones to the skull stack. When he found nothing else out of place, his shoulders dropped. Then the Bigfoot turned toward the blocked entrance. He looked at Philip once, then began walking. Philip followed, understanding that whether he was allowed to leave still depended on the decision of the one leading him. The Bigfoot walked ahead of Philip to the mouth of the ravine, where the two large trunks still sealed the old passage. He bent, slid both hands beneath the lower trunk, and pulled hard. Roots tore free from the mud. The heavy log rolled across stone, revealing an opening wide enough for a person to crouch through. Philip stood still. He was not yet certain this was permission. The Bigfoot looked back at him and tilted his head toward the opening. No roar, only a clear look. "Go." Philip picked up the backpack with the broken zipper, carried it on the one strap that still held, and stepped forward. His right wrist throbbed and his left shoulder could barely lift. He crawled between the two trunks, slid down into the mud outside, and turned back by reflex. The Bigfoot still stood inside the basin. The rows of bones lay quiet behind him. He watched Philip for several more seconds, then pulled the trunk back close to its earlier position, hiding most of the opening from anyone who passed by. Philip turned away. He tried to follow the navigation device, but the screen flickered because of moisture. Light was fading very fast beneath the canopy. Every step sent pain through his wrist and shoulder. When he reached a moss-covered rock slope, he slipped and fell again. The impact took almost all the strength out of his left arm. Philip understood he could not keep going in the dark. He found a low rock overhang with a dry space just large enough to sit curled beneath it. He used the rain jacket to cover the front, wrapped himself in the emergency blanket, and stabilized his wrist. He could not reset his own shoulder. The satellite phone had only 1 bar of battery left. Philip sent an approximate location and the message, "Injured, cannot move, need rescue." The screen showed sending, then shut off before he knew whether the message had gone through. Night came completely. About 1 hour later, Philip heard footsteps above the rock overhang. They were slow, heavy, and moved in an arc. The stride length was unusual. The sound stopped to the east, then appeared to the west. Philip gripped the multi-tool knife, but the pain in his hand kept him from opening the blade. A wood knock sounded from far away. Tock. No answer came. For many hours, the footsteps continued circling outside his shelter. Sometimes they vanished, then returned from another direction. Philip heard no bear, no wolf howls, no movement from predators. The area around him felt strangely empty, as if the other animals knew a large being was standing guard. Near dawn, Philip was exhausted and fell asleep. When he woke, gray light covered the rock slope. He heard people calling from below. A rescue team was following the last signal. Philip struck a rock against the wall to reveal his position. They found him at 8:12 in the morning. The team medic determined that his right wrist was likely fractured. His left shoulder was dislocated, and his body was mildly dehydrated. There were no bites or deep claw marks. In the mud beside the rock overhang, several long depressions remained, but rain during the night had blurred the edges. The rescue team could not identify whether they came from a person, a bear, or some other animal. The strangest detail lay 6 feet from where he had slept. His backpack had been placed neatly on a flat rock. Inside, the camera, notebook, food, and first aid kit were still there. The bear spray was gone. The multi-tool knife was gone too. In his coat pocket, they found a small bird bone, clean and white. It looked like the pieces that had formed the circle outside his tent. He did not remember picking it up. As the stretcher carried him out of the forest, Philip kept looking back. No one on the rescue team saw any Bigfoot. They only heard one lone wood knock echo from the northwest. Philip would never know whether the Bigfoot had circled the rock overhang to keep him from going back to the basin, or whether he had stood there to keep bears, wolves, and other predators away from an injured human. Maybe both readings were true. Or maybe the bird bone in his pocket was not a threat, but a sign that the order between them had been restored. After Philip was taken out of the forest, he was transferred to a small hospital east of the Cascades. The doctor confirmed that his right wrist was fractured, his left shoulder had been dislocated, and multiple muscle groups were bruised from hard impacts. Those injuries were serious enough to explain why he could not walk out on his own. But they did not look like the result of an attack meant to kill him. There were no bite wounds, no deep claw marks, and no tooth or nail impressions on his clothing. That caused the first search and rescue report to note that Philip may have fallen several times while panicking after an encounter with a large animal. When Marcus Hall, the rescue team leader, questioned him at the hospital, Philip said he had unexpectedly come across a black bear near the rock passage. He said, "The bear rushed from the brush, forcing him to back away, slip, and fall down the slope. After that, he tried to find his way back to camp, but became lost when darkness fell." The story was reasonable enough to fill out the form. There were bears in that area. The ground was slick after rain. Philip's injuries matched a hard fall and repeated impacts against stone. Marcus asked why the bear spray and the multi-tool knife were missing. Philip said he probably dropped them while running. When asked why the backpack had been placed neatly on a rock several feet from his shelter, he said he did not remember. Marcus looked at him longer than usual, but did not push. What Philip hid was not only that the Bigfoot had attacked him. He also did not mention the basin, the rows of bones, the bare skull, or the belongings of a man hidden beneath the skull stack. He knew that if he said even part of it, the rescue team would ask for coordinates. After that would come law enforcement, game wardens, researchers, hunters, and people chasing fame. If that place truly was guarded, the consequences could be much worse than what had happened to him. Philip's navigation device was recovered from the backpack. The data showed that he had moved northwest, but near the ravine area, the recorded path began to drift and form strange loops. The satellite signal had reflected off the rock walls, shifting the final coordinates by several hundred yards. Marcus tried comparing the track with topographic maps, but he could not find any basin that matched the vague description Philip gave. The satellite phone had successfully sent only part of the message before losing power. The first sentence, "Injured. Cannot move," never reached the server. The only line saved in the system was the 3 words Philip had entered earlier while frightened. "Not alone." Marcus asked what that meant. Philip looked down at the splint on his wrist and said he thought the bear was still nearby. The camera offered harder evidence to explain away. Most of the photographs inside the basin were clear: leg bones, deer antlers, skulls, and rows of objects arranged with intention. However, Philip deleted nearly all of them before turning the device over to search and rescue. He kept only a few landscape photographs and bear sign images for the official report. The pictures containing the large shape at the edge of the trees remained in a temporary folder he did not know how to access at the time. A technician later found 3 blurred frames. In the first, there was a tall, dark mass between 2 trees. The second showed a broad shoulder and a long arm. The final image held only a streak of charcoal brown hair along the edge of the frame. They were not clear enough to identify a species, but they also did not look like a bear, standing on 2 legs. Marcus kept copies, while Philip asked that they not be released, saying they were only a lighting error. The final report read, "Surveyor injured while avoiding black bear, became disoriented, and spent the night outside shelter." There was no line about Bigfoot, no line about the bone graveyard. After returning to Bend, Philip stayed away from fieldwork for almost 3 months. When he came back, his colleagues noticed that he had changed. Before, Philip often collected hair, bone fragments, or soil samples whenever he believed they might be useful. After the incident, he collected only when there was clear permission and a truly necessary purpose. More than once, he stopped students from picking up deer antlers, bird feathers, or strange objects just out of curiosity. He often said, "Observe first, touch later, and if you don't need to take it, leave it there." Mara noticed that her father no longer brought strange things home. When she asked why, Philip only handed her the small bird bone that had been found in his coat pocket. He did not explain where it came from. He only said it was a reminder that an object can belong to a place even when people do not understand why. 2 years later, Philip returned to that area in early fall. He went alone but did not bring any sample bags. He stopped nearly half a mile from the ravine at the place where the branches began to break in the same direction. He did not go deeper. Instead, Philip set an automatic trail camera on a tree, aimed it northwest, and left before dark. The next morning, he came back. The camera was still there. There were no claw marks and no signs of impact. In front of the lens, on a flat stone, lay one small bird bone, clean and white. It was the same size as the piece that had appeared in his coat pocket after the rescue. Philip did not check the memory card. He removed the camera, put it in his backpack, and left the forest immediately. That was the last time he ever went near that area. What keeps me wondering about Philip's story is not the charge across 30 feet, and not the strength it took to pull those waterlogged trees away from the entrance. What stays with me is the 40 minutes before that, when the Bigfoot only watched. He watched Philip enter the basin. He watched him take pictures, measure distances, and move between the rows of bones. He did not attack. He did not growl, throw stones, or block the exit. Only when Philip took the skull and tried to carry it away did the behavior change. An angry animal often reacts immediately to a threat, but the Bigfoot in this story seemed to evaluate every step. He identified what had been taken. He tracked the backpack. He blocked the exits, but deliberately threw the stone wide. He used force to control Philip, but did not bite, claw, or injure him beyond what was necessary. After that, he forced Philip to put each bone back into its proper place. If the story were only about strength, Bigfoot could have destroyed the camp or killed Philip inside the basin. But destruction was not what he wanted. He wanted restoration. In animal behavior research, many species show the ability to remember the location and value of objects. Crows can remember human faces and pass warning responses to other crows. Elephants can return to places where the bones of their own kind lie and spend time touching and smelling the remains. Beavers maintain dam structures across many seasons, and some primates can sort, store, and use objects for different purposes. None of those behaviors prove that any being created Philip's basin. This story is still fiction, but they remind us that order, memory, and awareness of a place with value do not belong only to humans. We call that area a bone graveyard because that is the easiest way to understand what Philip saw. But that name may be wrong. Maybe it was an archive. Maybe it was a territorial marker. Maybe it was a place for remembering the animals that had died in that region. Or maybe the rows of bones formed an information system that human beings simply cannot read. The important thing is not finding the right name immediately. The important thing is that Philip recognized intentional arrangement. He saw bones sorted by type, antlers turned in the same direction, and skulls placed by size. He knew the place was not a random pile of remains. Even so, he still believed that a scientific purpose gave him permission to take part of it away. Philip did not enter the forest intending to destroy anything. He was not a poacher or a man trying to harm the Bigfoot. But good intentions do not erase boundaries. Some mistakes begin with the belief that our knowledge matters more than the right of something unknown to remain whole. And this is the question I want to leave with you. If a being can remember every bone, recognize when one object has been taken, and protect the same place across many years, do humans still have the right to call that place an ownerless sample site? The wedding ring beneath the skull stack makes that question even heavier. Who did it belong to? Did that man die, run, or get released the way Philip was? Did the Bigfoot pick the ring up from an abandoned camp, or keep it as a trace of an earlier trespass? We do not know. Philip did not know either. Maybe the lack of an answer is what makes that place frightening. To me, Bigfoot did not attack Philip because he saw the graveyard. He attacked because Philip realized that place had an owner and then still took what did not belong to him. Because deep in the forest, silence does not always mean no one is there. Sometimes it only means the owner of that place is patient enough to wait for us to recognize the boundary ourselves. What do you think that basin was? A memorial, a territorial marker, an archive, or something else entirely? Share your explanation in the comments. And if this story made you look at the boundaries of the forest in a different way, subscribe to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories and stay with me for the next files. As always, the story you just heard is a creative work of fiction, inspired by Sasquatch folklore, animal behavior, and the geography of the Cascades. It is not verified testimony or a documentary. Sometimes the oldest rule in the wilderness is also the simplest. Leave what does not belong to you. I'm Victor, and I'll see you in the next story.